Okay, welcome to Creative Outcomes. My name is Ryan Watson. I'm a partner here at Upsource Accounting, and I am joined today by fellow partner Craig Baldwin. Craig, hey, how's it going, buddy?
Good. How are you, Ryan? Sorry to hear about the AC.
Yeah, sweating out here a little bit in the old home office. Otherwise, yeah, we're hanging in. That's okay. That's all right. So today we have a pretty juicy topic. It's actually making the rounds in sort of the LinkedIn sphere and kind of the broader agency zeitgeist. I think in part because of some large agency holding companies making some choices around this topic. And that topic is account managers versus project managers, AMs and PMs. What are they? How do they operate? How should you establish those functions? Should they be separate? Again, I think the reason this is a conversation is because was it McCann? I might be making that up. It was one of the large agency holding companies kind of went out and said, no more account managers. We're kind of going all hybrid. It's just one function now. And there's been a bit of an uproar around, wait a minute, is that the right choice? What are these roles? And so we have a pretty strong point of view for a couple of reasons. And so we thought, you know what? Let's get into it. Let's talk about it. So, Craig, I don't know. Maybe it might make sense. Obviously, Craig, you are the sales and marketing brain here at Upsourced, and so you've got certainly the most salient point of view on this topic. But maybe it might be helpful for us to sort of lay the groundwork around when people are talking about PMs and people are talking about AMs. What do they mean? What are these roles? What are these people supposed to do? Are they different? Like, how do you view these two roles in the world?
Yeah, totally. Well, and I guess I should probably point out too that when I wasn't just running sales and marketing upsource, I left running a 8-figure practice where I was the commercial lead and I had a head of delivery who was my counterpart, and all of the PMs reported to that head of delivery, and that head of delivery collaborated very closely with me as the person who led all the account people, right, as well as the new business sellers. And so I have a lot of empathy um, for not only working in that environment, but how to separate or segregate duties in those roles and why that's so critical. So let me just talk about what I think the function of the PM is, generically speaking, within your run of the mill marketing agency. And that's really to focus on execution of the team and to make sure internally things are going the way that they should, but for the benefit of the client, of course. So this person is running point on all delivery, execution, the time that's being spent. So it's not only important that we're delivering on the milestones that we committed to the client, but of course, it's important that we're delivering within the time bound of the scope, from a project profitability perspective. And they are also laser focused on supporting to this extent it's possible, because ultimately a lot of the, I'll call them SMEs, but your creative director or whoever it may be is really in charge of making sure the work is great. But they being the PM, is playing a supporting function in helping the team to be as successful as possible. And so when I've seen this role done really well, it means doing a lot of the stuff behind the scenes that most people just don't really want to do, but keeps the trains running on time. Like setting up meetings with the client, taking really great notes with the client, sending out reminders to the team on deliverables and when the next meeting may be, making sure that we're prepping for those meetings, making sure that we have done all of the reviews that need to be performed before we deliver to the client or present in front of the client, right? So there's a lot of stuff, especially as you talk about sort of larger creative work to larger organizations, where the quality control is a very big deal, right? Now, conversely, the account manager, who is very much working hand in glove with that PM on any given relationship, um, is managing the client, right? They are probably in front of that client on a daily, but at the very least, probably a weekly basis. They are managing expectation on the delivery of the work, making sure that the client is happy, or that we're getting the right type of feedback from the client so that we can continue to improve our work. Um, and overall, just managing the satisfaction, right? Because I think in most agencies, and by this I mean those agencies who are looking to procure multiple projects from a single client, that AM will likely be responsible for asking for or finding additional work. Now, I think it's completely legitimate that in many cases, the PM could be the best person to sort of unearth that opportunity through touch points with the client, through things that they're hearing behind the scenes. But those should always be immediately communicated to the AM so that the AM can focus on that responsibility. And so when we were off camera, I talked about how I think for the sake of a client relationship from their perspective, that it is important to have a separation of church and state as it relates to the person who's making sure that all the work is as great as it can be and on time, and then the person who's asking me for money, because I can see there being a little bit of conflict of interest on those two things, especially depending on the commercial makeup of the relationship, right? So I think most people would agree loosely with those definitions or those functional responsibilities. The question is, if I don't have the personnel, i.e., the headcount, in order to support them as two different functions, what do I do, Ryan?
Well, let me ask you. So let me ask you this first, Craig, because again, you obviously mentioned that you were a commercial lead at a very large professional services organization that, of course, had a PM function and an AM function. And so, in the ideal case, what is the right makeup of those teams? And what I'm thinking is like, okay, well, first of all, are the teams roughly the same? Like, does a PM handle as many clients as an AM, or does one do more than the other? And did you have any kind of rule of thumb about how many AMs you needed for a certain amount of clients or revenue, or like how should you even think about what's the ideal scenario?
So there's an important distinction to be made before I even get into that, which is I think in many organizations, a PM is billable or mostly billable. And in AM, I think for many of the agencies you work with, I actually don't think they're billing many hours, if any at all, of an AM, right? And so by way of that, I would suspect, especially for organizations who are not high throughput of clients, as I say, I'm working on many clients, which probably tie to an individual project for that client. I probably have a PM, especially in my previous world where we were doing projects that were usually 6 and 7 figures. I would only have a single PM across, I don't know, maybe two different clients or two different projects at a time. They were almost, in many cases, fully allocated, so to speak. So they were hitting your utilization target across multiple projects. But I would have an AM who was working across, in some cases, like a 7, 8, $9 million portfolio. So they were working across multiple clients. We were not charging for that AM to the client. And they were truly there to support the commercials of the relationship, make sure the client was satisfied from a what did you pay for perspective, but then be the first person to farm for additional revenue from that client. Now, that was probably more, honestly, that was probably more than more client work, or rather more revenue that I'd want a single AM to handle. This was kind of a constraint of our organization, but it worked, right? Now, that is to say, so I would expect multiple PMs to be working with a single AM, depending on the nature of the relationship. But I do think it's important to distinguish that the reason that I would expect that is because I think PMs are largely billable to the client. And for many of the clients we work with today, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of the AMs are not billing, or if they are, it's a very low amount. Um,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the answer to that question ends up being just really murky, right? Because these are fixed bid projects, and it's like I've got AMs doing work, and are they sort of implicit in the, are they or are they not? But I do think I do think answering this question and setting the right expectation is really helpful from the standpoint of like estimating what I even expect to earn. Like, am I Are the AM hours sort of implicitly baked into there, or are they not? This actually brings up another question for me. Not to make this an interview of me to you, but I have genuine curiosities now. So, and I think a lot of our clients would have this same, especially clients who are not doing account. And by the way, we should talk about like why, not just what account managers do, but why it's so important to have an account function. So we'll get there in a second. But um, before I go there, obviously, I think a lot of people understand like what does an account person do? They're there to manage the commercials of the relationship, manage the relationship. They're there to farm for new opportunities. Um, and maybe that last bit, the farming for new opportunities, is where the majority of their time should be spent. But I'm sure an agency owner is sitting here thinking like, well, I sold, a 3-month, 4-month project. There's a lot of execution work to do. My PMs are busy. My content people are busy. My designers are busy. But like the client is just in the middle of it. And so what is the AM doing? Like, I think the question would just be day to day, what kinds of things should the account manager actually be doing with this client, with this project? When it's going, when it's like running and and people are just kind of heads down. Is that, should they be farming elsewhere? Is that just a matter of that's why they have multiple clients and PMs only have one? Like, just kind of curious, what should my account people be doing?
It's a great question. The short answer is all of the above, of course. But I think a really good AM is um, very mindful. They're very good at weighing where their time should be spent in any given relationship, right? And so they're constantly evaluating the dynamics of, because if you think about, I used to work on Ford Motor Company 10 years ago, and it was probably close to a $20 million relationship for our agency. Um, we had multiple clients within that one client relationship being Ford Motor Company, right? So you could go and spend more time with one client as opposed to the other. You could spend a lot of your time focusing on finding the next new client. It depends on the size of the relationship. But I think for those working with large enterprises, I would fully suspect that the AM would be working day and night to build the trust and reputation of the agency as it relates to that enterprise or that single client. And sometimes that's with directly the person who is paying you for the work, and sometimes it's for other personnel, right? Um, they are certainly meeting with the PM at least on a weekly basis to understand how are we doing? Are we on track? Are we off track? Not only from a deliverability perspective, but from a budget perspective. And granted, again, this gets kind of nuanced depending on the commercial relationship with the client. Is it fixed bid? Is it time and materials? Are we charging by sprints? It could be any number of things, right? And I think that the role of the PM, by the way, if we're talking about a more engineering focused firm or digital product firm, those PMs tend to be a little bit more specialized. They tend to be more tech savvy. They tend to be scrum masters. They know how to run products. They people who really look and feel a little bit more like a product manager than just an average PM, right? So there's a real skill set there, especially a skill set that you can capture and charge for to the client. But that aside, I would want my AMs always managing their time um, to the extent that they think is the best use of it for the overall commercial health of the organization, which for them really means the portfolio they're responsible for, whether that is a small collection of projects, whether that's a large collection of projects and clients. It could be any number of things, right? But I'm looking to them, especially if I'm the owner or the leadership team, to manage a number, so to speak, right? I think we use that phrase a lot. They're managing a number, and to the extent it's possible, they're trying to grow that number or grow that pie. And in situations where we need to defend against any decreases, they're doing that as well, right? That just that mode of thinking alone would be, I would expect, distinctly different than the mindset of the PM, who is all about thinking about how do we just make sure we deliver the best work possible on time within budget. right?
Well, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a really important distinction, and as you're explaining it, I think it's crystallizing for me as well. Like, I think, one of the, and I don't know that a lot of agency owners are necessarily thinking of AMs in this way, but like PMs, their job is executing projects. AMs own revenue, like not that dissimilarly from a new business seller, right? And so, in much the same way, you wouldn't ask, what's a new business seller doing with their time? The answer to that question is they're getting new business and they're doing whatever it takes to get new business. And if they are having success with cold calling, then they're going to do a bunch of cold calling. If they're having success, in conferences or whatever, like it's their job to determine like what are the channels that are having the most success and what are the leads and prospects for which I should be spending the most amount of my time. And again, it's a new business seller to decide, should I be spending more time prospecting and filling my pipeline? Should I be spending more time mid funnel and moving these things down? Should I be spending more time closing? Like ultimately, at the end of the day, they own a number, and their job is to do the number maximizing activities. And I think an account manager is the exact same way. They own revenue. It's just that their revenue comes from existing customers, and their job is to retain and grow. And unlike a new business seller whose job is to bring incremental additional revenue to the organization.
No, the only thing I would add to that is I don't want to I don't want to label the AM as just a seller. Um, because I think and you've seen this, especially at organizations that you've been at, a really good AM is really a great strategist, right? They are someone who not only understands the type of work that's being delivered, probably has some expertise in that work. They may not be creative, they may not even be engineering focused, but they certainly understand products and delivering great products. If they work at a digital agency, if they're selling media, maybe they came from a planning or a buying background, and have moved on to AM world. These are people who should be seen as trusted advisors, so to speak, or strategists. And ultimately, that's usually the methodology that unlocks more work, right? Because they're constantly coming to the client and saying, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Should we try this? Could we tweak this? Right. So I think those people, more than any others, are probably expected to be more almost of a Swiss Army knife ilk, right? Like they're ultimate utility players. They have a little bit of knowledge across a wide breadth of topics. They are commercial minded, but they're not total idiots, so to speak, right? They have some level of expertise that the client trusts, and ultimately that's why we would get rewarded with more dollars, because the client trusts them. And I think the only other thing I'll add to this, and I think this is maybe more for larger agencies, is I worked at an agency that sold to WPP well over 10 years ago, and they're some of those founders have now started another agency which has seen incredible, tremendous growth. One of the things that they worked really hard to do, or they were very clever about, is they really position their AMs as strategists with their clients, so they could bill for those AMs, right? And so in that world, they would call the AMs business innovation. And by doing that, they were able to now give utilization rates and bill for those AMs. Now, the AMs still had the same responsibility to manage revenue and to hopefully grow revenue, but they were getting paid to do it, right? And so I think for those organizations who are even larger in nature, if you can work towards that model, that is incredibly powerful. It reduces a little bit of risk in your AM budget, and I think it's why you referenced McCann earlier. I think for so long, AMs have just been an accepted OpEx expense, or a different as an accepted cost of service, without a clear articulation as to the ROI of those roles. But if I can actually bill for that person, that equation becomes much easier, in a lot of ways. Now, it may reduce the scalability of that role a little bit, but I think most organizations, most agencies would probably take that trade off if they knew they could at least break even on the raw cost of the AM. and an exchange had some type of, incremental revenue that has been seen in the organization because of their work, right? So it's kind of like a free salesperson, so to speak. Is, that's maybe a bad way to put it, but you know what I mean.
No, I do. Well, so yeah, you talked about the large agency, and we talked about kind of what the ideal state is, and that makes a lot of sense, and that's kind of a helpful framing to work backwards to like because as you and I talked before we started recording, we live the vast majority of our clients are what we would describe as like subscale agencies, right? They may we're talking likely seven figures of revenue more commonly than eight. And so teams of this size might not have, they're sitting here listening to this and saying, yeah, we get it. Account is different from PM, and we want to approach those two disciplines differently. But I don't have that many people physically in my organization, and I don't have the margin to afford, just adding, two total teams. So like, how do I do this? What is the best way for me to approach? What are the, and let me also just say that I think usually, at least in my experience, like working with some of our clients, there's we usually have clients that have one or the other. Like they'll either call them account managers, we have account managers, or they'll call them PMs, we have PMs. And sometimes they'll sprinkle in some strategists. And I think your point was a really good one because to be honest with you, strategists are often account managers sort of labeled differently or could be account managers labeled differently. That might be a great place to go if you're trying to increment on an account management function. But anyway, many of our clients have just like one team. And I think that team is operating in a largely hybrid fashion. And quite frankly, they're probably doing one of the tasks fine and the other task poorly. And I would argue that regardless of whether they're being called AMs or they're being called PMs, at least in my experience, it's usually a predominantly PM heavy function where those folks are billing or they're doing utilization, utilized work, and they're shepherding the project and they're managing the execution, but they're not necessarily playing the traditional account role that would be responsible for retaining and growing revenue. And so a classic problem for us to solve is okay, well, what's the best way to handle that situation? So if I walk into an organization and they've got, four PMs, do I, split them up? Okay, I'm going to take these two, or fire two, hire two AMs, split them up, and there's probably a variety of like ways to execute this, but like I guess how should we think about approaching that problem? Like if you walk into that situation, what kinds of questions are you asking, or what are we trying to figure out before we decide how do we pursue an account discipline sort of separately from a PM discipline?
There's a lot to unpack there. There is a probably a formulaic answer. We commonly just say, hey, let's spreadsheet out this problem and work through what we think are the tolerable dollars and cents of solving this problem, and then we need to figure out if reality can meet that, right? So I think that goes without saying, but it is really critical because many people don't even do that exercise, and then maybe they have PMs who are only billing 30-40% of their time. They may even have one AM who's not billing at all, and they're wondering why their operating income sucks, right? We see that a lot. I've seen it a lot with clients that I've worked with. So we have to know the impact to gross margin, and we have to know the overall impact in net operating income of having any one of these roles within our organization. I think many organizations, especially smaller agencies, those who are compressed on margin or feel like they're getting um, squeezed on fees, are very gun shy about really charging for some of these roles, whether they're AM or PM, to the extent they should, right? And if there's anywhere to put your foot down, I think at the very least it's the PM role because it really ensures the quality of work and the timeliness of work. And so I think I've seen some of our smaller agencies really cut off their nose despite their face by not charging for PM which means they don't get adequate PM support, which means the project doesn't go really well. And now the client doesn't work with them again after that anyways, right? So I think if there's a role to say, or I'm sorry, if there's a time to say, hey, we're charging for this person as a part of the engagement, and here's what they're expected to do, and here's how they're going to support you and make sure this is a really great work product for you, it's that PM role. Now, I also think that one of the common sort of cultural ills or ways of working ills that we see in organizations of all sizes, but especially smaller organizations, is we don't have clear segregation of responsibility within the organization. That is to say, Ryan, if you and I are working on a client together and I am the PM and you are the AM, but we do a little bit of both of each other's work. And at the end of the month, the owner of the agency says to us, hey, is this client going to are they going to come back for more work, or what's the deal? If we haven't already clearly assigned responsibility to you as a part of that, we're going to point our fingers at each other and say, well, I thought he was doing that, right? It is amazing how often I see that mistake within agencies. When it's nobody's real responsibility, nobody does it, right? Or it's an easy way to, right, exactly, right? And so that's why I think having clear rules of engagement, if you will, internally about who's responsible for what, making sure that's only a single person who is responsible for that specific thing, and then empowering them and supporting them to perform is so critical. And that's why it is great to have those two roles distinctly separate if you can. Now, what I will say, in the situation where you may not be able to have an AM, it's a luxury, right, that you cannot yet afford. I would personally rather have the AM role come from someone who is looking and acting like a strategist on the engagement. I think that's a much more natural place um, for that commercial conversation to happen, because that's someone who's leading the thinking, so to speak, with the client. And ultimately what we're all selling is trust. And so trust equates to dollars and additional dollars. And so that person's usually on the front end of that trust. The other option is, and I see this quite often, is an owner of an agency acts like it's not their responsibility, right? Well, they're responsible for everything. I hate to tell you, like, you will until the day your agency is done, right? And so I really think that utilizing the owner or one of the partners of the agency as the de facto AM person until we can actually allocate a headcount is probably the best thing to do. And even if it doesn't scale incredibly well, I think it's critical, because for most agencies, especially up until the point you're 4 or 5 million, the client's probably buying the owner or partner's thinking anyway, right? So that, again, going back to that idea of trust, I think that the owner or the partner, one of multiple partners, should be the person managing the relationship, and making sure that we're doing everything we promised, and that we are earning the trust and the satisfaction of the client, and then asking for more money thereafter. Now, where this gets especially complicated, and I'll just say this last point and I'll let you run, is those agencies who are delivering a high number of projects to a high number of clients. They view that as impossible, untenable, not worth their time. And I'll be the first to tell you right now, that is not my favorite agency model. It's just not, for a number of reasons. But I totally understand why that particular approach would be very PM heavy and very AM light, but you're also probably pretty new business salesperson heavy too, right? There's probably a pretty large sales and marketing burden on that type of organization, because you're always having to go and find the next new client, the next new client, the next new client. And that is a very tough way to live. And it's a little bit of a separate conversation, but I think is an important thing to bring up as a part of this conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, you hit on a couple things that I had written down. The first thing that you made very clear, and again, so if you're one of these agencies and you have hybrid roles or just one role or no roles or whatever it is, I think the first point you made was a really important one, which is step one is determining or defining ownership. Like, somebody's job is to own the client relationship, retention of that revenue, and ideally growth of that revenue. Somebody has to own that. If we haven't explicit, and by the way, that's that is generally where the agencies that we work with fail. Like that has not been an explicit conversation, explicit ownership that's been delegated. So first is like somebody owns it and they're held accountable to it. And in a perfect world, they're incentivized by it, right? So that's step one. And so as you're making that determination, okay, all right, I gotta delegate this ownership to somebody. Who should it be? I think the second question, and you hit on this in your last part, is like, well, what is the AM opportunity? What is the opportunity here at my agency, right? So if I have, an agency where I work with really large customers that have like multiple divisions, departments, brands, I've maybe got like one project at each, like there's a clear land and expand opportunity. I mean, that could be my whole revenue strategy. I'd be incredibly AM heavy, new business somewhat relatively lighter. And so in that world, it's like, okay, well, I need, that defines how many people I need. Maybe the opportunity is larger, and it defines like the skill set of the people I need. Okay, I need somebody who can really get in there and can understand the business challenges and opportunities and strategy, and help me, navigate or matriculate through the organization. Versus, as you said, an agency where I work with a bunch of small, like mid-market companies. I'm doing smaller projects. Like there's clearly an AM need, but the opportunities to sort of land and expand or grow accounts is maybe just inherently smaller in those environments than in the others. So you got to answer those two questions, and then you can kind of go through the roster of, okay, this is somebody has to own this. This is the extent to which this is an opportunity for me. Now who's going to do it? And again, as you mentioned, strategists are a great place to look. Possibly you might have some PMs that are some commercial heavy that are just more AMs, and you just happen to call everybody PMs. And then certainly the owner is another place to look. Um, Let me ask you this question: new business sellers, is that a place I should look? Should I go to my current new business? Because we see that pretty commonly. New business sellers kind of have one foot in new business, one foot in existing business. How do you feel about that approach?
So I think it's perfectly okay to go to your new business sellers and make one of them an AM. Okay, let me say that, right? Okay, no problem. What I don't love and what elicits tons of bad behavior going multiple directions is when um, a new business seller goes into a current account, whether it has an AM or not, but it probably does have an AM for the organization is 4 or 5 million above a year in revenue, and goes and tries to sell additional dollars into that relationship. We've seen that now multiple times in our clients, and I know we've seen it in other places, and that creates for an AM. That's a situation where you have an AM who's not doing the job that you're paying them to do ultimately, right? So you're not getting value there. And you have a new business seller who is probably squeamish or having a hard time finding new business, which is what they're hired to do. And so they're trying to cover their what by securing revenue for the organization, but in a manner which the value equation is not quite the same. So you're now taking what is conceivably one of your highest paid people in the new business seller, especially as you contemplate their total compensation package, and you're putting them in to this area where they're finding incremental revenue within existing relationships, where that's really where you want to drive a outsized margin for the organization as a whole, because that AM is probably on a more fixed compensation model as opposed to the new business seller. And then, oh, by the way, if for whatever reason you lose that client and the new business seller hasn't been doing new business, well, now we're really screwed, right? Like both ends are totally screwed. And so this is something that we see a lot, and salespeople are better than any other type of role in the world at making excuses. So they'll be the first to say, well, yeah, but I found more revenue, or, hey, I created the trust in this relationship. The client just keeps coming back to me. Um, you have to have a clear handoff at some point in time to the AM and the delivery team. That responsibility has to be shifted, and you need that new business seller to focus on the thing you hired them for, which is new business, right? And so those organizations that I talk to that usually say, well, I want the new business seller to have the opportunity to find additional revenue. They did generate the relationship. They do have the trust. I'm fine with that. But I, as a general rule of thumb, usually like to cap that off at about a year time frame, right? That gives a new business seller enough time to squeeze an adequate amount of revenue out of a net new relationship, which I will admit is very hard to do. It's hard to find a new logo off the street and bring them in, right? So it gives them a year's worth of time that usually translates to one or two or maybe even three projects within that time frame. So we've given them a feel for who we are and how we deliver work and if they like our work, right? And it also gives adequate time for the new business seller to bring in that AM and for the client to be comfortable with that AM, right? So that transition, which is so critical, that is usually the time period where I like to do that handoff if you're not already doing it at the start of the very first engagement, right?
Yeah. Yep. That makes sense. Okay. Well, I mean, I suspect we could probably go on this topic for days, and maybe that's not the best use of everybody's time. But hopefully, we've at least convinced you of the importance of both the AM role and the PM role as a discrete discipline. And hopefully, if you are not at the sort of scale where you have the luxury of having these two discrete teams, we've given you some things to chew on, ideas for how you might implement within the sort of confines or constraints of your current organization. Craig, this has been awesome. Any parting thoughts? Any other feedback?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would ask of you, Ryan, is, and I think it's we kind of overlooked the beginning, but if you were to think about the nuts and bolts or the spreadsheet value of these roles, which I know that's probably going to get some eye rolls, but if I put a utilization target on a PM within my organization, am I okay with them being 50%, or do they really need to be like 60, 70, 80%? And conversely, for the revenue minded AM, how should I think about the amount of revenue they manage in comparison to the compensation they are paid?
Yeah. So those are some. It's funny. I've been working through these questions on a client at the moment. So I have some thoughts, though I don't have perfect answers. I mean, I think on the first, like in the I on the first topic, the question of like what's my comfort level with the utilization of a PM, I do find that conversation becomes pretty semantic pretty quickly because again, most of our clients are working on fixed bid projects anyway, and so ultimately, is this activity that they're doing for this client billable or not billable? I'll say that generally speaking, a PM is going to have greater context switching than a designer or somebody else. Like, or so, if you're doing a web project, you might have an engineer that's heads down for weeks or months. And so you should expect their utilization to be kind of where, that 75, maybe even a little more percent. I think a PM is because of their context switching, because they have 6, 7, 8 clients, whatever it is, they are naturally going to have a lower utilization rate as they're switching between things. And so I think in the like whatever 60-ish range is fine. But for the most part, every model is a little bit different. Like, we certainly have some clients where you're just going to have one PM on a project because it's really large. And so, to your point of like just seeing what works, I am usually just managing the utilization target at the service team level, period. Right. And so
It's like basically a blended utilization number across everyone who's working on the client. Okay.
if I can get my service team utilization, and again, we use not to go into the margin triangle, we use the margin triangle to decide like if I'm hitting a 50% rate and I think I can get 63, 62, 64% project margins, which let's hope I can, then that means I'm going to need a utilization rate in the ballpark of 70% blended for my overall service team, which means my PMs are probably going to be in the sixes, and my execution oriented folks are probably going to be in the upper sevens. That's probably where I'm going to be. Um, then with regard to I think with regard to how do you quantify the value of the AM to the organization, um, I think that's a lot tougher than a new business seller. You know what I mean? Like in a new business seller, it's really easy for me to decide, hey, I want your all in OTE to be, whatever it is, 10% or maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending on, the nature of how hard it is to get logos and what my lifetime value is, somewhere in that range. Whereas an AM, it's really difficult to sort of determine like what is the retainability and what's the upsell ability. And so To be honest with you, I think it really, really depends. Again, like if I have, that client or that profile I mentioned where I've got an enormous amount of land and expand opportunities. I can start to think about the ROI of putting an account manager in there and generating incremental opportunities, client growth. And I'm absolutely going to put a compensation plan, a commission plan in place to incentivize that individual. And they may not look like new business commission rates, but they're going to be pretty healthy. So I'm not going to pay them quite the same as a percentage of their revenue generation that I would pay a new business person, but I'm going to pay them probably single digit percents to generate that incremental revenue. But in a more traditional environment where I'm really focused on retention with kind of an incremental amount of upsell. To be honest with you, I think that looks more like I have sort of market-based retention expectations. So if I'm serving small business clients, I want, 80+% of like new business retention with some amount of upside. That's the goal. And I'm paying a market rate for that goal, right? Rather than, so I'm making the determination more of like, this is what the market charges for me to have a good AM, and this is what I expect out of a good AM. And I'm thinking less about like, what's the percentage of their salary of the overall revenue? Because I don't think that math really works in every case. Does that make sense?
It does. Are you putting the AM in that calculation you talked about earlier, along with the PM, where what is the overall billable rate?
That is a great question. And again, I think it really depends on. So, in the world that you've painted, where my AM is a strategist and they're providing strategy work, like the agency we referred to, where their work is somewhat billable, I am including them in. And by the way, again, in these subscale agencies, that is more common than not. It is more common than not that I have kind of a hybrid player who's mostly a PM and they're being supported on top. So let me give you an example. Here's a larger agency that's going to run a hybrid kind of a team. They have a team currently of, let's say, 10 PMs, and what they're going to do is leave that team largely untouched, but they're going to layer on top of those PMs to like account director, player coach folks who are predominantly responsible for the account, right? They're predominantly responsible for being that person who comes in and makes sure that the client is feeling taken care of and has those higher level conversations and is going to try to work the upsell. They are, as you said, relying on the PMs to unearth the opportunities. And then they're coming in to exploit those opportunities and try to get signatures. Those people are not going to be in that utilization target. They are not in COGS. Those two people live in sales and marketing, and everyone else lives in COGS.
Yep. And that is where on a given P&L, you would have those AMs who are not billing but supporting. They would live in the sales and marketing line item.
Marketing. Yep. Yep. Cool. All right, Craig, this has been good. Thanks, brother. All right, everybody, check us out. We've got the at Upsourced YouTube channel. You can get us at upsourcedaccounting.com. And until next time.
Awesome. Thank you guys.